So we're going to start looking at crimes in the Anglo-Saxon era, but to do this we need a bit of context. This means we need to understand what's going on at the time. So we're going to make some comparisons between this era and the later medieval period so we can make judgments about why crimes were seen as serious. So the work that you've done in Year 7 is going to be useful on the feudal system, the Domesday Book, and the relationship between the church and king will all become important in helping us to understand society in a deeper way. So we're going to pick up our study towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period at 1000 AD. Now remember, before this, the Romans left in 400, the Anglo-Saxons took over as the ruling dynasty from there, and the country is split into kingdoms. The population is only about 1.7 to 2 million people, and most people live in the countryside. There are some small towns, but it's not like when the Romans ruled, and powerful earls rule these kingdoms. So the most powerful earl is recognised as the king. You might also hear that as the signing. In this period, there's no such thing as primogeniture. So that is where the eldest male in the king's family automatically inherits the throne. So it's really important for the earls and the king to maintain law and order and stability, as this is what they're judged upon for success. So if we think back to Year 7, we looked at what would make a successful medieval king. And these were our factors, but the most important was maintaining law and order. This meant that you had the support of the powerful men and women in society, who are the earls, the barons, the really important people, and then underneath that is the lords. So they're going to make sure that the king's laws are followed in the kingdom and taxes are paid. Okay, the king must be a good warrior. He must not impact upon the lives of the ordinary people for stability to happen, but he wants his laws followed. So this is how society is set up and how the king is going to keep everybody in his place then. So the king is at the top. Then we have our tenants in chief, who are our earls, and they're in charge of these kingdoms. As you can see, you've got Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. Okay, below them, so they will have loyalty to the king because obviously he will have given them their land, and they in return will pay him taxes, and they, if you remember the feudal system, will obviously help him fight in times of war. And you will also see that they need other people to help them rule because they can't control everybody in the different areas. So they will have thanes, which we will know from Year 7 as lords. Okay, and they will control the local areas. Now these are most likely to become the king's sheriff reeve later on, who meets with the locals and makes sure that the king's laws are known by them and also they are dealing with them effectively. Okay, below that we have the creoles, who are freemen. These are peasants and they own a certain part of land, and they will perhaps, I say own, they're renting, they would probably do 2 to 3 days work on the thane's land as well, maybe as part of that rent. Okay, they've got no say in the making of the law, they've got to abide by it, but they are free, they are not owned by anybody else. So below this in our peasant area is the villeins, the boarders and the cotters. Now these are going down in order of importance as to how important they are in the village. They are owned by the thane, so they have to do exactly what the thane says. They're not free to do what they want, so they can't just go and move areas. They have to work on the thane's land, and if they want to become free, then they're going to have to work their way for it. And below this are the slaves. So this hierarchy is really important in keeping everybody in their place, and each person is important in this area to help keep law and order, maintain law and order for the king. So he has to gain their loyalty, but also their respect. So additionally, the church is really important. So Anglo-Saxons had prayed to a number of gods. This is the inheritance from the Roman times. But Christianity became the main religion under King Alfred the Great at the end of the 9th century. So the king is chosen by God, if we remember. This is called the divine right of kings, and this means that the king is God's representative on earth. So the king is not questioned because they tend to have the ultimate authority in making laws. People who follow them will follow their method of law and order because they are God's representative on earth. However, in the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope is God's representative. So this meant that the king is subject to a bit more of a check on his power, and the Pope could be argued to be closer to God. Now, we saw problems with this between King Henry II and Thomas Becket, and we looked at this in Year 7. And in some areas, the church plays a closer role in the peasants' lives. If they were their landlords, for example, on land around abbeys and monastery estates, and the church owned a significant amount of land in England. So they would have the role of the thane and the earl. So a second son, for example, in a family would perhaps be sent into this area because this is a way of making money. They're not going to inherit their father's money. So this would mean that they play quite an important role, again, in helping to keep law and order. So generally, their role, though, is as final judge. God is the final judge of innocent or guilt. So if your local community can't decide in a jury, then a trial by ordeal will be held. So you might have to put your hand in boiling water and pick up a bar, and then if the burns have healed within 3 days, God has decided that you're innocent. You might have trial by cold water, where you're ducked underneath. The priest has blessed the pond beforehand, and if you are floating, then you're rejected by God, and therefore you're guilty. So these trials by ordeal don't go out until 1215 and are important in showing the role that the church plays in our law and order in society. So all this really links back to is how important God was in people's lives. He was really important in explaining the unexplainable. Science hadn't been developed, so bad harvests, plagues, etc. were all explained by God being upset with the people and their behaviour. Our priests are the most educated people in the community, and they're important for the king. So they help pass on this message that God has chosen your situation and you'll have a better life after death in the afterlife if you're not a sinner on earth. So this helps the king to maintain law and order. And churches, cathedrals are the largest buildings around. They're built out of stone and are a clear sign that the church is your judge, but will also protect you, as we'll find out later on in the medieval era. Angels and demons were supposedly in a constant battle over human souls, and Christian saints are your everyday companions, and praying to them can help you. So the church is quite an integral part of our peasant's life. So in a village, all the people are important in playing their part so that everyone can survive. You need to play your role. The thane is the most important person in the village, and they own the manor house and most of the farmland. As a Creole, a villain, a boarder or a cotter, you'd be expected to work on their land and help grow farm goods. You would pay your taxes to them, and you'd also be judged by them in a court if you'd done anything wrong. So this made them the authority, and any crime committed against them would be a crime against authority. This is very serious, as they were needed to keep everybody in place. So as you can see, wood is going to be really important as well. Buildings, farm equipment, all needed, and tools all needed, wood all needed to be made for survival. So this would suggest that a crime such as arson, where you deliberately set things on fire, would be seen as a serious crime. Not only were you damaging property, which is probably belonging to an important person, so therefore a crime against authority, but you're also endangering the others in your village, so crimes against the people. The blacksmith made weapons and tools, but metal is really expensive, so they're not as important as a carpenter in village life unless there's a war. As this is expensive, theft from them is going to again be seen as really, really serious. Villagers farm to provide food for themselves to be able to survive, so anyone harming this or doing anything silly was threatening the lives of the whole village. Villains have their own farmland. This is split into strips of land in different fields to make it fair that no one got better land. They'd be told what they could grow on these strips by the reeve. You will see when you look at the crimes that neglecting your land, so disease could affect the harvest of others, or growing the wrong thing are all regarded as crimes at this time. So this may really seem silly to us today, but it's a real threat to the success of everybody's harvest, so this is really important. A villain is elected each year called the reeve, as I mentioned earlier, and they would be the boss of this. So they would negotiate with the manager of the thane's property, called the steward, to decide what should be grown and how much and where. They are then in charge of making sure this happens in the village. So there is also common land. As a peasant, you can graze your animals there, forage for food, e.g. you can capture rabbits, collect wood, so you can supplement your food that you've grown. This is not a crime, but is a really important part of life. This becomes important for us later on as William the Conqueror takes over and makes changes to this. Likewise, animals are really important to daily life. Horses are rare, but oxen, like strong cows, are used to pull ploughs. So they're used in farming and to kind of make sure that everyday life can happen in the village. So crimes against these, again, might be quite serious. You as a village are accountable for your neighbour's behaviour. You are in a tithing. So all men over the age of 12 are in a group of 10 called a tithing, and they're responsible for each other's behaviour. So a bit like today's use of peer pressure. They'd be punished if the person in their tithing could not be found if they committed a crime. They'd be responsible for making sure that they behaved. So thinking about what might happen if a crime is committed. It's the victim's responsibility at this point to seek justice. But the whole community is responsible for helping to bring justice about. It's your duty as a member of the community, as you'll see in the number of people involved in the Monty Python sketches that you'll watch later. It's the duty of a member of the community to be involved in this keeping law and order and justice. So one man from each area, this is called 100, and one man from each tithing within the 100 have to go and meet the king's shire reeve. So probably your thane, your lord. This is how the king is going to make sure that ordinary people will get his ideas and understand his ideas about law and order. They have to prevent crimes such as cattle theft, and when chasing a cattle thief, the hundredsman, so the person that's kind of in charge of the area, could take 2 tithing men with them to track this. Likewise, anyone who witnesses a crime can raise something called the hue and cry. So this is where you shout for help. Everyone who hears it has to stop what they're doing and chase and capture the suspect. Then if you can't find the suspect, you can then pass it on to the king's shire reeve, who later become the sheriff, as we all know from Robin Hood. So this should have given us a nice summary about what life is like in Anglo-Saxon England, so we can make the comparison with how William the Conqueror makes changes.